Our next speaker is somebody who I have followed on social media for a long time, but this is the first time, Dr. Emily Meadows, we actually get to meet via StreamYard. It's lovely to have you here, Emily. Thank you for joining us from the Netherlands.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for including me in this fantastic event.
So I'm going to disappear and let you start your presentation about designing LGBTQ plus equitable schools. I'm looking forward to listening and learning to you, Emily.
Thanks, Hannah. So, thank you all for being here. What an inspiring first session to follow those students. And I loved the comment from Jaya about we are the future, and I couldn't agree more. So today's my session today is about designing LGBTQ equitable schools. I also want to mention that my pronouns are she, her. I'm an LGBTQ consultant for international schools, and I also teach for the George Washington University program, our graduate program on LGBT health policy and practice. So are you able to see my slides here? Hopefully. Well, I'll start by saying lots of schools. So I work with international schools really all around the world. And lots of schools call me looking for sort of a solution, a toolkit to take their school from being really LGBTQ erasing or marginalizing to being LGBTQ equitable. And definitely some tools are necessary in order to cultivate belonging and equity for LGBTQ people. And of course, I do provide that in my practice as a consultant to schools. But providing just sort of a toolkit, whether it's a set of lesson plans or a book list, something like that, without doing any foundational learning about the systems that are in place that marginalize LGBTQ people is sort of like asking for a set of scissors without learning how to first cut hair. It will more often than not be impossible to achieve your desired result just because you sort of have that tool in hand. So in order to design equitable schools, we can't just have a few tools. We really need to look at the full system, and address that. So some schools are not asking necessarily for a toolkit. They think, all right, we've got our good intentions in place, and that should be enough, right? We care about queer kids, and that should be sufficient. Similarly to the toolkit not being sufficient, good intentions certainly are not sufficient on their own. We cannot protect kids from harm just by intending for kids to feel safe at school. And if you think of it like this, if we continue with the hair metaphor, you might envision the most gorgeous hairstyle ever. You might even have, pictures of it and like that intention of achieving it or crafting that style. But if you don't have any knowledge or skills about, say, braiding or doing this style, if you don't have practice or understanding about the hair type and texture that you're working with, it's going to be really hard to recreate it and achieve your result. And the same thing goes for LGBTQ equity and belonging. If you don't have sufficient understanding of the practices of this work and the background and the understanding of the systems that are in place that marginalize queer kids, your intentions, your good intentions, are not going to be sufficient. So, thought of another way, the problem of inequity, marginalization for LGBTQ people comes from a systemic marginalization of LGBTQ people. So your good intentions alone are not enough to create or to design an LGBTQ equitable school, because the problem of inequity is not a result of your or any other individual's bad intentions. So correcting the intentions alone isn't going to do it. So a reminder of what I'm referring to when I say LGBTQ, we're talking about folks who maybe sort of fall under this big umbrella term, which refers to people who are marginalized based on sexual identity or gender identity. So this can include a lot of different people and identities that might not be part of that acronym LGBT or Q, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, or questioning. But me, for example, my letter's not up there. I'm pansexual. I use the term pan. There's no P in that acronym, but I still consider that label or that umbrella my home because I am a minority in that way. And I'm going to try maybe share my slides one more time, see if they come up this time, but if not, we'll just move forward. So to design LGBTQ equitable schools, again, good intentions are helpful, of course, and good tools are certainly going to be a benefit, right? If you have that curriculum or that book list or whatever it may be, those sort of tools, you've got the intentions, you've got the tools, but if you're operating within a system that marginalizes queer people, then those are not sufficient. We need to actually address the underlying system. So how to do that, what I recommend to design LGBTQ equitable schools is to look at the systemic structures in addition to the practices. That includes really the policies around support and equity and belonging. So for example, check and see if your school has a non-discrimination or anti-discrimination policy or commitment statement. What does your school say about equity and belonging and diversity? Anything or nothing? Either way, it sends a message. Does your school have policy in place to support transgender students? So things asking about, playing on sports teams, using the restroom that aligns with people's gender identity and that kind of thing. Is there something in place to ensure equitable access for trans kids and people? What about your child protection and safeguarding policy? Does that acknowledge that systemic harm is being done when queer kids are not, needs are not sufficiently met? And how does it look, does your safeguarding policy look at LGBTQ inclusion as a way for harm reduction? Hiring and employee benefits. Can queer teachers be safely hired at your school and receive benefits for their partners? Harassment and bullying protocols. Is there an acknowledgement there that queer people have been historically targeted more than the general population, and that there needs to be systems in place to prevent and correct that? Admissions processes. Does your school offer equitable and inclusive admissions policies based on gender and sexual identities? And finally, your dress code. Does your dress code discriminate based on gender, or does it offer the same options for all people regardless of gender identity? These are some examples, certainly not a complete list, but examples of ways that schools can look at the systemic structures that are necessary to support LGBTQ equity in schools, and then layered that with the toolkit and the good intentions. You're well on your way to correcting some of the previous issues that we've seen that exclude queer kids, and on a way forward to safer, more equitable schools for children. So thank you so much, and I'm happy to move to Q&A.
Emily, thank you for your professionalism there. I'm so sorry the tech wasn't working. That's so frustrating.
It happens. No worries. It happens.
Super slick in your delivery. I want to pick up some of the words you use, because from my experience of working with schools, in the UK, the protected characteristics of gender identity and sexuality are the two that schools perhaps are most fearful of getting wrong or getting right. And even your use of the word queer, I know that some generations have been told you don't use that word. It's an un-PC word. Would you just speak a little bit about the language and the terminology, just to unpack perhaps some of the inhibitions?
Thank you for that question, Hannah. Absolutely. So the term queer is definitely loaded. So I myself identify as queer, so I'm happy to use it, but you're so right that it isn't a word that I recommend people throwing around. Always, every individual is entitled to use whatever language works best to describe your identity, sexual and gender identity. You pick what feels good and right for you, and you use that language that is yours to claim. But in terms of talking about other people's gender identities and sexual identities, we always want, the good rule of thumb is to follow their lead. So never applying labels to other people, but to use the language that they use to describe themselves. And as you said, particular caution around the term queer, just because it can be seen as offensive to some, and we want to respect that. I use it because partly because LGBTQ is less practical. So if I'm using that as an adjective, it's a one syllable adjective that works well. But yes, you're right. Use it with a dose of caution.
And it is an acronym, like you say, that keeps being added to, and it can be a bit of a mouthful to get out sometimes. So, and I know there's been a kind of a reclaiming of some words by some different marginalised groups, and queer has been reclaimed by the LGBTQI community in some ways as well.
Indeed.
Staying with language, because the acronyms, like we love an acronym in teaching, don't we? And there's so many acronyms.
That's so true.
And in the UK, we used to talk EDI, but I think from a US influence, DEI is becoming more and more common. But I know from your international kind of like networking, I see DEIJ and DEIB. Do you want to unpack those terms a little bit for the audience?
Oh, I'd be happy to, although I wish I had more time, but yes, so it's constantly changing, and I love that because I think language matters, and so it's changing to reflect the priorities of the community. So the acronym that I am using more when I work with schools is DEBJ. So diversity, which simply means difference, and it exists. It's neither good nor bad. It's just the way of the world. The world is diverse. Equity is when folks have equal opportunities to access outcomes. So it doesn't mean everyone has the same thing, but everybody has what they need to have equitable outcomes. DEB. Belonging is the B. That's a sense of feeling that one is safe, that one is part of something, that one is included. So that belonging, so we can have diversity and have a mix of people, but it doesn't mean much if not everyone has a seat at the table or equal voice. And J is for justice. So that is a reference to repairing harm that has been done and acknowledging that harm and addressing it and correcting it moving forward. So that's the short version. But
no, that's fabulous. Thank you. Because look, I think language can be such a barrier. And one of the phrases you used in your presentation was harm reduction. Could you just unpack that a little bit further for the audience, please?
Yeah, sure. So when it comes especially to LGBTQ people, we know that there are a number of risks associated with stigma and discrimination. So there's nothing inherently risky about being LGBTQ, but when the context is stigmatizing, that creates a number of risks such as depression, anxiety, other mental health issues, substance use, etc. And so when we're thinking of a harm reduction through a harm reduction lens, we want to reduce the stigma and the discrimination in order to reduce these risks. So that's something that can be done with schools that is really impactful to promote safety, health, well-being for LGBTQ children.
And it's that link, isn't it, that DEI work is safeguarding work, and it's about keeping people physically, emotionally, psychologically safe in our schools.
Absolutely. It's all about that. If you don't have safety for children in schools, you really can't begin to even do the learning. Kids that don't feel safe are not going to be prepared to come to school ready to learn. So that's our first responsibility as educators, is safety.
And final question from the audience, great question here. Do you have any top tips for getting teachers on side when they don't believe we should be using trans and non-binary people's chosen names and pronouns? How do you navigate that?
Yeah, absolutely. I work with loads of, that's a huge part of my job. And I work even in countries where LGBTQ identities are criminalized. So we all come to this with our own beliefs, our own backgrounds, our own upbringing. And the vast majority of us were raised in transphobic and homophobic cultural contexts. So we carry that with us. I think education is a big part of it. And so in my trainings and in my workshops, I help folks understand, but I take a non-judgmental approach. So it's not about who's right, who's wrong. It's really about, let's focus on kids' well-being and safety, and prioritizing, as with the previous session, student voice and their narratives. It's not really how we think, it's what they feel and their identity.
Absolutely, but I guess creating the safety for the staff to have those conversations as well, because like you say, that we've got unpacking and reflective work to do in order to be able to support the students as well.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, Emily, thank you so much for joining us. It's been lovely to finally meet you and hear from you. You've got lots of lovely comments in the chat. I'll see you soon. Take care. Have a great Saturday. Thank you. Bye.